Welcome to the CR podcast, Unpacking Europe. My name is Elisabetta Cornago, and I am Assistant Director at the CR, joining you from Brussels. So Trump's aggressive stance on Greenland has gotten everyone in Europe thinking hard about transatlantic relations. Trump's threats have had security repercussions as well as trade impacts. We have discussed the security side of things and the implications of Trump's rhetoric on the NATO alliance on a recent episode of this podcast, where my colleague Armida van Rij discussed with Stan Rinning, Professor of War Studies at the University of Southern Denmark. So do catch up with that one if you missed it. But today we'd like to focus on the trade implications. So what seems like a rupture in US relations. And I have the pleasure of welcoming Associate Fellows of the CR for this very purpose. So John Springford and Anton Spisak, welcome to you both. Let's start with you, John. Can you unpack what's going on, really? So the trade escalation and de-escalation we've seen between the US and Europe in the past 2 weeks.
Sure, I can do my best, and Anton can chime in if I've missed anything. But broadly, the story is Trump saying he'd impose tariffs and then backing down. The longer version is Trump said he'd impose tariffs on the European countries who did military exercises in Greenland in response to his threats to take over the territory, presumably, preferably by buying it. But he completely failed to rule out the use of force. And then Denmark, Sweden, Norway, France, Germany, UK and others sent a tripwire set of small forces to Greenland. That stoked Trump's ire. And he said, OK, I'm going to impose tariffs on you for doing that. The difference this time round from last year's trade agreements after Trump had done his last round of tariffs on the EU and the UK, and the EU and the UK both rolled over and agreed to higher US tariffs on EU goods and lower ones on US goods. So they reduced tariffs on US goods from where they were. Unlike rolling over last year, the EU, but not the UK, they said that they were going to consider retaliation. They said they would not ratify the Liberation Day deal from last year if Trump imposed tariffs on Greenland. There would be work on retaliatory tariffs. And some politicians, notably Emmanuel Macron, said that the anti-coercion instrument, the so-called big trade bazooka of the EU, that might be in play. And on the UK side, Starmer did his usual thing and ruled out retaliation with tariffs. And in the face of that, plus a kind of concerted diplomacy, plus the market reaction, plus Republican Congress people looking a little bit nervous, Trump backed down and said, okay, well, we've got a kind of framework for agreeing a deal for US engagement in Greenland, brokered through NATO SecGen Mark Rutte. And as a result of that, I'm going to back down. So that's kind of what happened. I don't know if Anton has anything to add, but I think that's hopefully at least a fair summary.
I mean, I agree with John. What I personally found really extraordinary about this instance of tariff threat from Trump was that this really wasn't about trade. In the past, the Trump administration had some concerns about what it would describe as unfair trades, imbalances in the global economy, and it would justify imposing tariffs on its trading partners as well as adversaries on the basis of doing some adjustments in the global economy so that, things could change. This was really about using tariffs as an open instrument of coercion against America's allies. And I think this was really quite something new. And in many ways, this was a turning point for European leaders because they saw that the strategy that they've adopted up until this day, which was let's try to be pragmatic and let's try to appease the US administration if we really can, has not really worked out. And I think that's why the reaction this time has been a little bit more robust and even in some ways more coordinated than in the past. I think, a lot of the European leaders responded to the US president within a couple of hours and said, this is unacceptable and we will impose retaliatory measures if it comes to these tariffs. And they revived a lot of the work that was done in preparation to last summer. So there was already a package that was in preparation by the European Commission. It was a package of about, I think, 93 billion euro of retaliatory measures to potentially use tariffs. And they said they would be prepared to revive that package in addition to potentially doing some other things. And John mentioned the now famous anti-coercion instrument, which is a piece of legislation that the EU passed a couple of years ago that gives European leaders a really broad discretion about what they can do in instances like this. So they can not only impose tariffs, but they can also do some other useful things, such as stop operation of some US companies on the European continent or withdraw some rights from American firms in the European procurement markets. All of these things are quite useful if you need to act quickly. And that is potentially an instrument that the European leaders can activate. The other really important thing about the anti-coercion instrument is that it can be activated by a so-called qualified majority vote in the European Council. And that's a really important thing because usually there is one or two or three member states that would disagree with things like that. But in the case of the anti-coercion instrument, it doesn't require every single member state to agree to that.
So absolutely, Anton, you pointed out how forceful, perhaps in an unusual way, the European response has been, both through the package, as you said, the retaliatory measures and the threat of using the never until now used anti-coercion instrument. So what do you think then really swayed Trump, or what has been, I suppose, the impact of this set of responses, forceful responses of European leaders, alongside the reaction, or compared to, I suppose, the reaction of markets or US domestic politics? Which one do you believe is the one that has convinced Trump to step back from his strategy?
I think the answer probably depends on who you ask. If you ask European leaders, I'm sure they would say that, this is really about us responding in a very robust, rapid, and coordinated way, which is quite different from what we did last time. If you ask a financial analyst in the Wall Street, they will probably say this is just another example of what they would describe as taco, Trump chickens out. But I think, probably it's a combination of both, but also the fact that domestic politics was not very favorable to Trump in this instance. There really is not a broad support for annexing Greenland in the US Congress, even though, Republican politicians tend to agree with Trump on most major foreign policy decisions. On this one, there just really wasn't that kind of broad support. So I think the Trump administration must have realized there was probably quite little political gain from this quite disruptive action that they would actually need to do this time round. And, of course, on top of this, you also have the Supreme Court case about the use of tariffs that Trump administration implemented last year, and again would have to actually trigger this time. And there is just quite a lot of uncertainty whether the Supreme Court will actually uphold the use of those emergency powers that Trump decided to trigger in invoking these quite wide-ranging tariffs. So I think there is quite a lot of different things playing out. But I think at the end of the day, really, it was probably domestic politics that really made a difference to Trump. I don't think we should be under very much illusion as Europeans that it was the fact that President Macron tweeted, that this was unacceptable, or that UK Prime Minister said that this was wrong. I think it was ultimately probably the combination of the market reaction plus domestic politics that really pushed Trump to conclude that, there was very little domestic political gain to be won from this.
Can I just add something very briefly? I think the thing about these kind of three different potential reasons, the Europeans retaliating or threatening retaliation, the markets and domestic politics, I think they're all kind of part of the same thing, or they all interact with one another. And that gives you a sense of why I think the European decision to just roll over last year was wrong. Because, the market reaction to Trump announcing the tariffs is down to a couple of things. It's down to the cost of the US economy of imposing the tariffs, because US consumers and companies have to pay them, plus the heightened risk of a cycle of retaliation with the EU retaliating and then Trump hitting back and so forth. And then that market reaction has an impact on domestic politics. And I think that, in the sense that Republicans get scared if markets are doing badly and the economy, or at least people's 401ks, their pension plans are doing quite badly. And so in that sense, European leaders do have some power here, because by threatening retaliation, then they affect both the market reaction and US domestic politics. And last year, after Liberation Day and the tariffs leading to kind of market freefall, the fact that the EU and UK were pretty circumspect and then ultimately rolled over with a deal, it kind of convinced Trump that tariffs work and that repeated threats are going to work. And the fact that they stood up to him and he backed down this time is an important signal, I think, to European politicians to change the way that they deal with Trump's tariff threats.
Absolutely. I think you both, in a way, pointed to how the clash that we just observed differs from perhaps the missing clash that we should have observed in a more forceful way in the spring after Liberation Day. So I think it's fair to say that Trump's keenness, in a way, or at least his lighthearted approach almost to a pan-transatlantic relation seems to have prompted a reckoning of sorts among allies. And this may have been a long time in the making. Really, it's been 1 year of Trump's second administration in the White House, but arguably these recent events are focusing minds, and not only in Europe, in fact. Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, made quite memorable speech at Davos last week, arguing in favor of variable geometries when it comes to middle powers building alliances, both in security and in trade. Do you think this idea of variable geometries is then the next frontier for trade deals? So going beyond multilateralism and towards a more perhaps ad hoc approach to deals? And how does the EU fit into that world? Maybe, John, let me come to you first, and then happy to hear Anton say as well.
Carney's speech was very good and has had a lot of plaudits, and I think partly because it rose to the moment in the sense of middle powers need to stand up to increasing authoritarian behaviour and imperialist behaviour by the United States. The question about whether in trade the kind of agenda that he set out is really deliverable is much more open, I think. So, multilateralism is pretty much dead, right? I mean, the WTO, we haven't had a round of further tariff reductions since 1995. Free trade agreements have been responsible for most of the barrier removal since then. So the question then is about plurilateralism of, several countries and entities in terms of the EU joining together. And I think there I'm fairly skeptical. So in terms of middle powers banding together to stand up to the US or China on trade specifically, it's always quite difficult because everyone has their sectors that they want to protect, generally in sectors of the economy where they're less strong or less productive, or they want to protect particular political constituencies, i.e. farmers. Or they have kind of offensive interests where their exporters are particularly good and they might, by opening markets, then they might be able to get more export sales and so forth. And because all of the middle powers have different strengths and weaknesses, then it's very difficult for them to coordinate vis-a-vis the US or China, unless, of course, they put together institutions like the EU where you essentially have a common external trade policy. And I don't think that's going to happen. But that said, I think that behind the scenes discussion and public summitry between middle powers is a good thing because it will allow them to kind of coordinate responses to the most egregious behaviour like Greenland, share what works among them, perhaps do some coordination where possible. I mean, we didn't see coordination between the EU and the UK here because Starmer said, no, we're not going to go with tariffs, whereas the EU did. And then broadly, I think, in terms of the kind of Carney doctrine, how it will come out, it will come out more in kind of continued thrust for bilateral deals with middle powers. So the richer ones, between them, they already have very low tariffs. It's unlikely that they're going to make huge steps forward in regulatory alignment because they don't have the institutions like the EU to make that happen. They will, however, seek to sign more agreements with poorer countries. So, recently we've had the EU Mercosur and the EU India agreements being signed at least, although there's questions about whether they will be ratified. And I think on the margin, there will be more demand from poorer countries for bilateral deals with the richer middle powers because they want to have the stability that provides vis-a-vis a chaotic US, sort of dirigiste and sometimes bullying China. So I think plurilateralism I'm sceptical about. I think bilateralism through FTAs will be the way that this makes fruit, and multilateralism will continue to be dead.
Anton, I'd like to hear your take on where you sit on this continuum, I suppose, between multilateralism and then bilateralism. And I'm going to tie that in a way also to the next question I have in a way, which is we saw last week that EU Trade Commissioner Shevkovich published an op-ed in the Financial Times arguing the WTO needs reform. Again, probably a statement that will come sooner. And in a nutshell, he was calling for the need to revise also the most favored nation principle, arguing that, and I quote, access to lower tariffs cannot be unconditional. It must be earned through stronger, credible commitments to the core principles of free trade and fair trade. What do you make of that?
Yes, I think it was really quite an important op-ed actually by the EU Trade Commissioner. What Shevchovich said was that what we need to do now is to rethink a system of global trade governance that has been in place for the last couple of decades and on which the WTO is built. And he made one very specific proposal, and that is to link the most favored nation status of countries, which is really the fundamental principle of the global trading system and as it was built after the Second World War. And that principle really ensures equal treatment between trading partners. He said that we should link that MFN status to the principle of fairness in global trade. And in many ways, you can understand where there's this impulse and this kind of communication comes from. It comes from the fact that what we are seeing in the global economy are some pretty serious distortions in some markets where trade has been distorted by excessive use of subsidies in some countries, especially in China, by a lot of regulatory barriers, by a wave of protectionist barriers as the nature of trade and the global economy is changing. So we can see where this impulse to call for rethinking of the MFN principle is coming from. And it also makes sense in the context of what John described, and that is the fact that the WTO system has been effectively stalled in the last couple of decades, well, since the Doha round, and that what the ultimate objective of what WTO used to be about, which was universal liberalization of trade, is not really going ahead. So you can see where this impulse is coming from, and yet I think it's really important because the EU, in many ways, is the last man standing in the global trading system, the last defender of the WTO as we know it, because the other two major economic blocs, the US and China, are in a very different camp. The US has effectively given up on WTO, and the US has effectively given up on WTO for a long time. Even before Trump, the US refused to nominate judges to the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, and that effectively rendered the WTO in many ways dysfunctional. But what has been significant since Trump came back was this real, what I would describe as preferentialism in treating different trading partners. Let's give 10% to one country, let's give 20% to other, let's do this on a product basis. So what the US did was it basically threw that MFN principle out of the window. So for all intents and purposes, the US has already given up on the global trading system as we know it. Now, what the EU is saying, the EU is effectively opening this Pandora's box and saying, let's tinker with the edges of this WTO fundamental principle of the MFN and let's explore how to amend it in different ways. If you want me to offer a constructive reading of this, it is basically just the Commission acknowledging the new reality and saying, we need to be more flexible in the way that we do things at the WTO. We need to open up more space for, all these side agreements where we give some concessions to some countries because they are friendly to us, but we don't give those concessions to others. And I can understand that. A more cynical take on this would be to say that this is all about putting pressure on China, but also trying to appease the Trump administration and try to come closer to the US vision of the global trading system. And I think that's where I'm a little bit more skeptical with what the Commission actually put forward. I think really there is a lot of danger in opening up this Pandora's box because I think it can lead to quite a lot of really difficult arguments at the WTO and with trading partners about what this reform would actually look like in practice. And we have to bear in mind also the context for this. For the European economy, the European economy is dependent on openness and open global markets. The European economic model is one where you really are dependent on free trade and open markets. And so to try to really unpick some of the principles on which the global trading system is built on is, in my view, not the best idea.
We've seen also that this latest development have had obviously also repercussions on, well, some ongoing bilateral deals, right? The EU is still in the process of negotiating a deal with the US. And we've seen that the European Parliament has reacted to Trump's aggressive rhetoric on Greenland by acting on that. So how likely is it that MEPs, members of the European Parliament, will approve the deal after putting it on ice at the height of tensions on Greenland?
There seems to be a bit of a gap opening up between EU leaders and the European Parliament, at least, the beginnings of a gap. So EU leaders, Friedrich Merz, Chancellor of Germany, Antonio Costa, the President of the European Council, have signalled that they want stability now. And so they want to go through with the EU-US deal that was agreed last year, I guess because they think, well, we've made an agreement and it's important for our credibility that we sign it. And also, there's still a big need to ensure that the Trump administration doesn't cut off Ukraine completely, and the politics are still quite febrile on that, particularly as trilateral negotiations between the US, Ukraine and Russia continue. On the other hand, Bernd Lange, the chair of the European Parliament Trade Committee, recently posted that, and I quote here, "Hardly any details are known yet about the proposed Greenland deal, but we need them in order to decide how to proceed with the implementation of the EU-US trade deal." So he seems to be saying that he, at least, and we'll see what other MEPs think, but he would like to try to tie the ratification of the EU-US deal to a resolution over Greenland. And the other point that he made in that sort of mini thread that he posted was that we shouldn't assume that because Trump has backed down now that further threats won't come, which I think he's right about. And so therefore it's important to set boundaries and thresholds for the various instruments that are at the EU's disposal and make clear what is going to prompt these instruments to be used, which I think is also the right way to think about this, because as we saw with Trump saying, no, we are going to impose tariffs on countries that didn't do what we wanted in Greenland, despite the fact that we had trade agreements with them, is that Trump's word just cannot be trusted on trade. At the drop of a hat, Trump will smash that tariff button as hard as he can whenever a country does something that he doesn't like. I think it's sensible to say, okay, we're going to tie the ratification of the trade deal to resolution to Greenland because that hasn't actually been resolved. And I think it's also sensible to say, this is how we will respond to any further threats, and these are the thresholds that must be passed to trigger us to use the instruments that we have.
Maybe just to add to what John was saying, I think I would just say that MEPs have been unhappy about the EU-US deal since the very moment it was agreed between the Commission President and the US President last July. There was really a lot of unhappiness, if not anger, at the way that both the negotiation between the US and the EU was handled by the Commission, but also about the contents of this deal. Just to remind people, this package involved the EU removing most of its import duties on US goods, while the US still maintain a broad tariff ceiling of 15% on EU exports, and the US also maintains the 50% tariff on EU exports of steel and steel products. So, in many ways, this agreement from last summer has been seen as unbalanced and asymmetrical in the view of many MEPs, and I don't think they really changed their mind about this deal. The Greenland fiasco really just reinforced the sense of real unhappiness and rage about what had been agreed over the summer. This was already a sentiment of many MEPs, and if the vote before the Greenland episode would have been very, very tight, already in the parliament now, it looks like it will be even tighter, even if you secure a support of most mainstream groupings in the European Parliament, the vote will still be incredibly tight. I think what we can say with certainty is that MEPs will force some sort of safeguard in the final legislation. And there is a question about what that looks like. It will probably involve some sort of automatic termination clause in the instances when the Trump administration does something really outrageous in the future. There will be some sort of possibility of automatic suspension by the Commission if it presents some sort of report finding that the actions of the US were unfair to the EU or something of that sort. So I think that's probably one very concrete change that we will see. And it's really important that the Parliament passes this legislation ultimately, because that is the legislation that is giving effect to the EU tariff concessions to the US. So without this legislation, the deal that was agreed between the US and the EU last summer is not really a deal, it's just words. So I think we'll have to see what happens. I don't think it's certain that the MEPs will support this deal. I think it's entirely plausible that this deal will not get through. And in that case, that can be a real friction between the US administration and the Commission if it doesn't happen, because we don't really know what will be the response of Trump in that case.
Anton, you mentioned the unhappiness of MEPs with respect to the EU-US trade deal, but that is not the only trade deal about which they are unhappy these days. We've also seen movements with respect to the Mercosur EU deal. I was wondering, what is your take with respect to the EU's new trade deals, the new generation of trade deals, really, with Mercosur, but also the even more recently announced deal with India? How do they fit within this discussion between multilateralism and bilateralism? And what could be expected of the politics in this sense?
I think it's really interesting because I think there is a bit of a paradox here. I think the EU and the Commission in particular has been incredibly successful at negotiating new free trade agreements in the last year or so. It just concluded an agreement with India. It has been a long time in the making. It also concluded an agreement with Mercosur countries in South America that was being negotiated for something like 25 or 26 years. It also updated its agreement with Mexico and, Indonesia last year. You just look at the numbers. I think you can reasonably conclude the Commission did a pretty good job negotiating new FTAs, and those were not easy negotiations. And yet, at the same time, there is a lot of political unhappiness about these new FTAs, both from member states, but also from the European Parliament. It seems like nobody in the European system really wants to own the kind of political price that these new FTAs actually bring to the table. It's a bit of a paradox, I think. And you really saw this in the Council. So when the Mercosur deal was being voted on in the Council, it was only a very narrow vote that secured its support among member states. And that is only because of the fact that the Mercosur deal is actually two agreements. When people talk about Mercosur, it's actually a trade agreement, but it's also a political agreement. And the reason why it was done in that way was that the Commission Legal Service already anticipated a lot of the difficulties in the ratification process of that agreement. If you go back to 2016, and this is a long time ago now, the EU had a real difficulty ratifying the EU-Canada deal because one of the regional parliaments in Belgium decided to block that process. The lesson that EU lawyers took away from that was that you really need to separate out those agreements in a way that separates the EU competency from the competencies of national capitals. And that's the reason why Mercosur was able to go ahead, in the Council at least, only with the support of some member states, but not all of them. But then we get to the European Parliament, and the European Parliament decides to postpone the ratification of that deal by seeking an opinion from the European Court of Justice. And we'll have to see how that process unfolds, but this can potentially really delay the whole ratification process, depending on what happens next. The ECJ will have probably somewhere between 10 to 18 months to decide a case. And the Commission has a bit of a headache because it could, in theory, provisionally apply the agreement even without the support of MEPs. And that would guarantee that the deal can go ahead relatively soon. But if it does so, then it will go against the MEPs that are already unhappy about the way that the Commission is already handling trade negotiations. And that might really backfire on other files, including ratification of the EU-US deal that we just talked about. So I think the Commission will have to make a decision fairly soon, but it will be a very difficult decision to make.
It looks like, from what I've heard from both of you, that there are several changes happening in EU trade policy vis-a-vis the US, but also vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So we may be looking at really at a turn in the page of the trade playbook at EU level. And at the same time, it's not exactly clear that we have reached a new equilibrium in EU-US trade relations. And more broadly, there's a lot of tension in the transatlantic relations here. So what is your perspective? Have we reached a new equilibrium? Are we on the cusp of seeing a new trade playbook in Europe, or what is ahead of us in trade?
In terms of the US, I don't think we've reached an equilibrium in European US trade relations because Trump just loves tariffs so much. I mean, he uses them whenever a country does something that he doesn't like. He just used them against South Korea, another ally, which also had a deal signed last year. And, quite often he backtracks a bit after a market reaction, but tariffs often end up higher. I think that's why the taco, the Trump always chickens out meme isn't entirely true, because there's a bit of a ratchet effect where he will throw his weight around, stick up tariffs, markets freak out, he backtracks a bit, and then the tariffs are higher than they were. I also think that there are lots of things that can go wrong, quote unquote wrong, in the EU-US relationship that could lead to him going for the tariff button again. So the obvious culprit would be the tech sector. I mean, if the EU regulates or enforces its tech sector rules in ways that the US doesn't like, and here you can see a major pitfall, again, quote unquote, in terms of the EU announcing an investigation into Grok, Elon Musk's AI model, which, as I'm sure all of our listeners know, has been making AI nudes of women. It has been making nudes, or at least, they're dressed in bikinis, but it's been doing the same thing with children. And so an EU investigation into that has begun. It's pretty clear that violates whole swathes of EU legislation. There's a real chance that there's going to be a falling out over that, particularly as Vance and in particular, and also Trump, have been accusing the Europeans of violating free speech norms. And also because the tech sector has been using the Trump administration as an instrument in its battle against some of the EU's legislation in this area. And then the other thing that could go wrong is the Europeans not going along with Trump's peace plan in Ukraine and backing Zelensky if he ultimately decides that the territorial concessions that they're demanding he can't accept. So I think we're almost certain to see more of Trump smashing the tariff button. We'll have to see how the EU responds.
Anton, what is your view?
I would agree with John. I wouldn't call this an equilibrium. I would probably maybe just call it a ceasefire in the trade space, perhaps. I think we should be really under any illusion that this type of thing is not going to come back in some shape or form in the future again. I think what will be interesting to watch is how much the EU actually gives in to some of these pressures that Washington has been creating for the EU, not only on tariffs necessarily, but also on what John mentioned is the question of tech regulations, digital taxes, environmental laws, and pressure on China. And we already see some examples of that. So, for example, if you look at the EU's proposal for the new system for regulating and managing imports of steel into the EU, you already see some resemblance of how the EU is thinking about that question in a very different way and in quite a similar way to how Trump administration is thinking about that. What the EU is doing is replacing the existing system with a much tighter system of quotas and also a 50% tariff on out of quota duties. So that is, very similar to what Trump did in many ways, but also much stricter rules around where the steel is coming from, which again is something that they borrowed from the US. So I think, that will be an interesting thing to watch. Is the EU trying to give into the pressure that Trump created? And if so, how far in the interest of maintaining that relationship with the Trump administration? And I just don't really think this is going to go away. I think, in many ways, this has been a turning point in the transatlantic relations because I think, it really forced a change in the way that the European leaders look at the Trump administration. I think there's a far more realism now about what can be done with Trump, but I don't think that this is going to go away.
Thank you both. Yeah, I think you both provided a very sober assessment. So thank you very much for joining me on this week's CR podcast. I'm sure there will be more trade fluctuations to discuss and dissect. Thank you, John Springford. Thank you to Anton Spisak. Thank you all for listening. And please do subscribe to the CR podcast on your chosen platform.